This workshop is supposed to be on student organizing in Kjipuktuk, about which there is actually not too much archival information unless you go deep into the Lynn Jones archives, which I didn't have a chance to do. But we're going to talk some about some of the previous movements and just draw some lessons from that, and then we're going to do some stuff as a group, like drawing on our organizing experience and things we need, things we have, and working together to just draw out our organizing capabilities. So I won't talk at you for 2.5 hours, in other words. Okay, so I guess the first thing I wanted to say, and I don't have like PowerPoint or anything, so I got to do all this from my head / my phone. But I was looking back into the history of NSCAD, and I don't know how much you guys know about organizing at. Do you know how NSCAD became an art school? Have people talked to you about this? Okay, so you know who Anna Leon Owens is, first of all? The King and I. If anybody's seen that musical, the extremely colonial. Yeah, so I mean, she was a founder of the art college, and that's why I see Anna Leon Owens gallery. So right away we know that NSCAD has like colonial and specifically like transnational colonial identity. It's really like, I don't know, I find it really weird that people don't recognize, I don't know, I guess you guys aren't big fans of like the old Broadway musical or whatever. But if you've ever seen The King and I, or if you've read her memoir, it's a memoir about her being a governess and then teaching in the court of the king of what was Siam at the time. It's an untruthful memoir, to say the least, so people who have done critique of it have obviously compared her Orientalist recountings of teaching in this court to documentation we actually have. The way she represents the king is, again, extremely Orientalist, right? So as like really repressive, the view of the harem. So this is all done through a very like white liberal feminist, like, oh, the king is like so sexist, and I came to free the woman of the harem, and then he fell in love with me, like the white woman, and then I white saviored him and like taught him how to love properly, and then he died, right? So I don't know, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, like if you actually read about her, there's all kinds of stuff that she was untruthful about, like starting with her own heritage, and there's some interesting stuff about her kids, so we won't get into all of that, but just to say that right at the founding of NSCAD, we have a colonial narrative. But then NSCAD, of course, becomes like the art college in the 1960s, so when Kennedy comes in as president, and I don't know if you guys know too much about this, but this is when NSCAD becomes a really legendary art school. But it has a lot to do with social forces, right? So in the 1960s, they're moving, like as technology changes, you're really moving from a production art economy where art colleges are largely present to teach skills, like actual manufacturing skills in art. So you still had like printing and stuff that was happening on a daily basis. So art colleges were teaching like mechanical trade skills to people. And then as we get different technologies, those skills are moving out, so art colleges have to sort of shift from being actually training grounds for creating, like working craftspeople into becoming art schools. And so part of what's happening in the 1960s is this new president that they hire from college in the US. He's like 32 years old. He comes in and he brings in basically the conceptual study of art. So NSCAD has moved from being, in essence, like a working class college into bringing art theory, art history, and all these different forms of art politics into the classroom. So they expand to have art history, they start bringing in artists for international talks, and NSCAD explodes and becomes really one of two, at the time, like legendary art colleges, one being in California where there's a big feminist art explosion, and the other being here with conceptual art. So I'm pausing here just to say that the irony of your admin at this point suggesting that a teach-in is dangerous for NSCAD is really ironic when you look at how NSCAD is forming itself as an internationally meaningful art college, because the whole claim to fame that NSCAD has is that NSCAD is now going to be this political art college where art has relevancy and meaning, and they're bringing in political and conceptual artists who are doing political work, and this is how NSCAD is founded. So in 2024, we can think about what that means for an art college with a board that is now scared of teaching and learning as they're also collapsing the art school, as they're in massive debt, as they can't handle their budget, as they did an ill-timed expansion into, Pier 21, and then sold out their board to a bunch of developers, right? Which now who is actually on the board, and then can't even do the work of creating art anymore. And so when I was looking up, and now I have to go to my phone because I'm not, I haven't memorized all of this, but one of the things, so I looked up like the 5 things that NSCAD is like most famous for in the art world, and this will make you guys laugh, because one of them is a publication by Jenny Holzer. Are people familiar with this? It's a book that was published by NSCAD Press in the 80s, I think. Yeah, 83. And the title is Abuse of Power Comes as No Surprise. So this is a book based on a conceptual art project where Holzer was creating slogans that would draw attention to how language creates or doesn't have meaning. So she was going around New York, and so it's an early form of like print activism, right? Like so she would make these slogans and print them on T-shirts or posters and put them up under New York. And so the idea was that you would have to interpret what these slogans meant as they kind of just came into space, unanchored from context. And then NSCAD Press prints this book that's like extremely valuable. It's a conceptual book that includes a pull-out poster of the phrase "abuse of power comes as no surprise," and then has all these slogans. And this is considered one of the 5 top contributions of NSCAD to the art world. So I thought we could just reflect on that phrase as a first exercise. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. So what does that mean to us in the context of what we're doing and the organizing right now? So I guess this is my first, I'll stop talking and we'll do some collective work. So we're gonna think about this phrase. By the way, her latest show, although there was some critique, included, at the Guggenheim, included phrases from Gaza, including phrases drawn from testimony of parents crying over their children, phrases from Palestinian poets. So again, material that is apparently too dangerous and threatening for NSCAD to like teach about. This artist is engaging in that material, just to say that. But let's think about this. Do you guys have a mic, or you want to, I don't know. I want us to just reflect on this phrase. I'm going to start pointing out profs, because I know you'll not. Val, what do you think? Abuse of power comes as no surprise. What reflections does that draw for us in this moment?
In this moment?
Yes.
Well, it reminds me of a phrase in Al-Anon, which is "Don't go to the hardware store for oranges."
Don't go to the hardware store for oranges?
Which is, I guess, when we have neoliberal and conservative institutions operating in all of the ways that you've just described, which is that, NSCAD is now so much about real estate and debt as opposed to about art and politics, right? Then what does that do to the education mission and to the production of art and to the imagining of other worlds, right? So, I mean, the students of NSCAD are much more expert on this than I am, so.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Sorry? Just in this age of neoliberal education, just to think about how universities have shifted their terrain from, educating, and I would say particularly being open to educating like diverse, like the working class, people who don't have access to education, to being real estate ventures and corporate entities based on, exploiting international student revenues, building, flipping. I mean, that's what universities are really, just real estate ventures at this point. So she was just saying that it just makes her think about, so that phrase, like, don't go to the hardware store for oranges, like, don't go to a university for justice, I guess. Like, don't go to a university for a liberal education anymore. Like, you're here to pay the fees for the developers and corporate board, I guess.
So, expand your mind. Now that you just an extension of the educational system, which is to create workers.
Yeah, so if you heard that, universities used to be based on the idea that the elite classes went to expand their minds under the idea of a humanist education, and now they're places that are part of the production line of creating future workers. So those even so-called, even those which were already colonialist, patriarchal, etc., values around what classical and humanist education meant, but even that pretense is being removed, and now it's just like, get them through this production line, which is why they're scared of teaching. Anything else? Any other reflections people have? And we can just reflect on it through the talk. I just thought that was one of the funny ironies that, you know, NSCAD will like put that book up. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. Well, they abused it, obviously. I mean, anyone else? Go ahead.
It just reminds me, I was at NSCAD in the 80s, and it was a very white school at that time. I'm hoping that it's different now in that sense. And a friend of mine who was in art education organized for students to go and do art with children at the North Branch Library. And we had wonderful art classes. Children did amazing stuff. And then she organized a tour of NSCAD of the students from the North Branch Library. And they just wandered around the school. Well, it was like an organized tour, but it was, I think it shook the school up a little bit, having their youthful energy and I remember one thing. Well, they had the life drawing in this room with the sliding doors opposite the cafeteria, and of course some student, one of the children, opened the door and looked in at the life class. But there was also one of the students at NSCAD was the son of the president at the time, and his project was knocking a hole in the concrete wall. That was his art project at the time. So I don't know if what that's symbolic of, but the children got to see that.
Could you all hear that?
Elle, maybe it's relevant to talk a little bit about what happened.
I'm about to go there, don't worry. That was next on the agenda. Go ahead. Oh, yes. Oh, you did.
Maybe there's a second
Oh.
there. The cord's not long enough to give to people.
Also, like, or we could swap the two.
Yeah.
Just like pick the cord up.
Thanks, Owen. This is not even a formed thought, but like thinking about abuse of power being expected makes me think about the email exchange with the NSCAD president, and just thinking about like how these people that are in the positions that they're in because they come from places that are not so like liberal educated, like, yeah, I don't know Peggy's history or care, to be honest, but I feel like the presidents of our universities, the people that sit on the board, have not, like, I don't think they have, like, I don't think they belong there. And I feel like that's a big part of the abuse of power being expected, because it's like they don't even need to know their own laws or read the emails completely, because like the email response back to Owen was basically just, I did not read your email and I'm still abusing my power and saying you can't do this, because Owen's email back was obviously like indisputable, but they know that they can abuse their power because it's worked into these institutions, into their, like, there's a loophole for everything for them. And I feel like that's why I feel like in the government, in universities, in every state institution, like, it's written in it to be abusive of power, and they can just refer to some subsection of a document that they don't even read. Anyways, that's what I was thinking.
Well, I did look up pyramid, and there's chock full of ironies in their bios, if you want to know. So you said you don't care, but from 2011 to 2013, Dr. Shannon served as the principal investigator of a Shirk Research Partnership Development Grant to study gender and war.
We do want to know how to do it.
Intended to build knowledge through a distinctly multidisciplinary and international research team and offer a unique approach to trauma and gender research, humanities, and social science. Research has worked alongside practicing artists, as well as media producers, military mental health researchers, and civilian neurologists treating brain trauma. Okay, so then if we move to the provost, over 20 years as an academic, her teaching explores how society is continuously challenged to break down barriers.
Shut up!
Barriers that stand to separate individuals and ideas. Art and design in their most authentic forms are created to fracture barriers and initiate dialogue with individuals. So, I mean, this is, there you go, you know, and you can read through all these bios, and everyone has these decolonial bios, and, you know, they're interrogating and breaking through and fracturing. And then you can't talk about current events because it's scary. So, yeah, thank you for that. Gave me a chance to,
Thank you for that.
to share my, I mean, I didn't do research, I looked on the website, but just to say that, like, this is really common. Was there someone else that wanted to say something? Yeah, and Val was saying to bring up Charmaine. That's actually where I was headed next. So to bring this to student movements, one of the first protests, the first set of protests at NSCAD in the 60s were actually, because they held a big international art conference where they invited 18, it's known as like the, I don't know, the group of 18 or something like that. And they were able to bring in 18 pretty famous practicing artists to have a conference at NSCAD to discuss the future of art. No women were included. And in fact, when a group of women artists wrote the president to complain about that, he only recognized one of the names of the woman artists, like in the letter that was writing to him. But the way it was set up was that the artists were in a room upstairs, and then the students were only allowed to listen on a relay downstairs. So they were not included in the conversations. So 3 of the artists walked out and refused to participate because the students weren't being involved. And then the students also protested that, and that was, so it's kind of interesting that it's this legendary conference, but in practice, they didn't even come up with a manifesto. Like, there was no action plan. The students were basically extremely excluded. And that was one of the early protests when you look at the history of NSCAD. Students also protested the mass layoffs of their professors, and so this is often talked about as a good thing, like the president came in and laid off all these profs and brought in these, like, you know, top profs. But of course, who was being laid off was profs that were teaching, like, basic, you know, like the practice of art, people that were there to teach, like, working class art, if I can call it that way, being replaced by, like, high conceptual New York artists. So local artists that were engaged in local art practices were laid off in favor of making NSCAD this international conceptual school, right? So students had a huge protest outside for that. So this is some of the history of NSCAD. And of course, this is all positioned in the 60s, where we are in the midst of course, the largest contemporary, like, social upheaval, from the women's movement, the civil rights movement, all the various struggles that are happening at the time. And schools are responding to that. It's like a fire.
What the whoa?
Smoke coming from the vents.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should we call someone?
He's on fire. Probably coming from the kitchen now.
Yeah, it smells like food.
Yeah. Burnt pizza. Is that normal, or is it like?
Good question.
They're gonna check.
Everything's fine. You're just cooking chicken, is what I was.
Not very well.
Or too well.
But they're good. That's what they said.
You know what? I feel like that's an art phrase, right? Just cooking chicken. Isn't that what we're doing right now? Okay. Yeah, so then I wanted to, and Val brought this up, obviously Charmaine Nelson's tenure here. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. So you guys know that Charmaine Nelson, who's at the time was the only, and probably still is, the only tenured practicing Black art historian in Canada. So Charmaine Nelson was teaching at McGill, and she was heavily recruited by the previous president, Ife McNamara, to come to NSCAD because there was a recognition that NSCAD doesn't have diverse faculty or diverse practices. So as part of coming, part of the package, she got Tier 1 Canada essentially gets a cut of, because they don't have to pay the teaching salary because that's paid through the chair. And then the chair comes with quite substantial research funds. And part of what she was coming to do was build an institute. So institute on slavery and transatlantic slavery and art. So there was a number of fellowships that came with that she was able to give to students. And so this was part, and then of course 2020 happened, and universities, including NSCAD, made some serious commitments around diversity post George Floyd. And so Charmaine's presence here was supposed to be part of NSCAD's reparation. This is what you were talking about, right? That when students from the North End came to the school, they didn't even know what to do with that. So recognizing the school has traditionally not been accessible, has not taught diverse art, has not had Black people or racialized people on staff. When Charmaine came here, she's recounted this publicly. So from the beginning, she experienced anti-Black racism and repression from the admin, including basically, I don't know if I want to use the word stealing, that might be considered inflammatory, but holding onto her research funds. So for example, when she was trying to hire students, the university would not release the funds that were her funds. So she was not able to access her own research funds. They would send public scolding emails to her, so she wrote on her own volition, because they would not provide any information. She wrote a handbook for her institute on things to know about navigating NSCAD or info. There was a mistake in it, and they sent an email out to everybody, basically trying to shame her around these mistakes. Basic stuff couldn't get a name tag for your office, all of these things. So she was unable to do her work. They were completely dismissive of her work. And Charmaine left publicly, and this was actually national news, that she left and identified the racism that existed at NSCAD. The day after she left, they fired the president, Ife McNamara, who had been deeply involved in bringing the diversity initiatives to NSCAD. So in one fell swoop, the person of the transatlantic slavery, I forget what it was called, but it was a transatlantic slavery and art institution, left because of racism, and the president responsible for recruiting and bringing her was dismissed by the board. To this day, they have not said why they dismissed her. Interestingly enough, she actually was balancing the budget. So, even, I guess they liked racism more than they liked money or whatever was going on with that, because she was actually a very successful president. So I'm just saying that to say this is also part of what this current board has done. They left in a university that is extremely broke, that is in debt, and is under threat of the government taking them over, because if they can't make up the debt, the provincial government has to step in, right? They were willing to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars that came along with this chair and this institute. A huge amount of funding that university, because they get a cut of the funding. Every time the funding comes in, they get a cut. So they were, and just the salary itself, so hundreds of thousands of dollars that they were willing to leave on the table and not have, because they couldn't treat Charmaine Nelson with the appropriate respect. So I just wanted to raise that. Is there anything else that valid in that scenario?
It's so telling of white-dominated colonial institutions, and also of the pattern of, what Robin Maynard has framed as the whitewashing of slavery in Canada after all of this institutional, you know, media coverage and this like path blazing institute, and then basically within how long did it take before Charmaine left? Like it was like
a year.
Yeah.
And I also want to connect this to what is being experienced now.
Exactly.
So again, I want to identify, you know, and the students, you have all identified this, the underlying racism and Islamophobia that comes with deeming certain types of information and teaching and learning as threatening to the institution, and without even articulating what it is that you think would be threatening. By the way, some of what they listed as threatening was people who are belonging to the NSCAD community. I taught at NSCAD, and ironically what I taught at NSCAD was this, social movements and art. I took over Max Haven's courses when he left, and the course was social movements, art, and like politics. This workshop is called Student Organizing in Kjipuktuk. So essentially the exact same material about how art and student movements relate. They paid me to teach, but now is too threatening to be inside the building, so we have to sit out here in blankets to talk about. So I just want to identify what's happening there. And this is completely familiar. And remember I said that NSCAD at its founding is a form of transnational colonialism. Like Annalia Nones is an Orientalist. This is the exact discourse that we are getting around the issues of Gaza, either too complex for us to understand. Genocide is far more complex than we can really manage, which is an Orientalist idea of the mysterious, unfathomable East, right? That so Ukraine's not complicated, you know, but oh, you know, Israel-Palestine so complicated, centuries long, like as if every conflict doesn't have the exact same factors, and if every conflict isn't complicated and simple in the exact same way. But obviously this is deeply tied to fears of racialized people's learning and knowledge and teaching. And so what happened with Charmaine is not disconnected to the narrative you're getting today. And in fact, when Charmaine left, there was all kinds of narratives around her disorder, her disruption, her, you know, like she didn't do, you know, the way that they responded to that. So I also wanted to connect this. Okay, but I said I'd talk about student movement, so I'm going to do that briefly. I claim briefly. I'm going to do that for a little bit, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to do some work together on movements. But I was looking up student movements. I was interested in this, and I thought that I'd like live up to, you know, what the title of the workshop was. So the first thing I was looking up, and if we were inside, I'd have made us watch this documentary because we had lots of time, but we can't. But if you have CBC Gem, you can watch, there's a series called Revolution, and the second episode is called Revolution Remix, and it's about the Sir George William campus so-called riots. There's also a documentary called The Ninth Floor if you're interested. How many people are familiar with Sir George Williams? Okay, so this is the former Concordia University. So this is what Concordia used to be. So to take us back, again, we're talking about the 60s. McGill obviously had an international student body in Montreal, but McGill had extremely difficult standards to get into. Sir George Williams had much more accessible standards. So as a result, in the 60s, once Canada's opened up immigration, they end up with a lot of international students and a large amount of students, particularly from the Caribbean, so Black Caribbean students. This is obviously at a time where the civil rights movement is taking place in the US, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and so student activism is like the Vietnam War. You have a lot of Americans coming up that are so-called draft dodging, that are coming up, particularly in the academic sector. So you're getting like American profs coming in and American grad students and stuff. So this is all fomenting at the time. And Canada also has a Black civil rights movement taking place, including, of course, in Halifax with Rocky Jones. If you read Rocky Jones's autobiography, Rocky Jones Revolutionary, from Forward Press, 2017, you can read, and some of this information is in there. So Black Canadians are also engaged in a discussion about racism here in Canada, pushing back on the idea that racism exists largely in the US. So as people are protesting, and Rocky will talk about this, like when Rocky got involved in politics, he's actually walking around Toronto and he sees this protest. He's like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, we're protesting Black people not having the vote in Alabama. It was all white people. And Rocky's like, okay, and he jumps in and grabs the sign, and of course media shows up and they go straight to him because it's like the one black person. So he's like, just repeats what he just been told, and overnight they're like, Canada's Martin Luther King. So overnight he becomes a civil rights figure. But Rocky obviously had deep experience with segregation in Truro, with racism. So he very quickly started putting the pieces together in terms of political activism, what him and his family had experienced. His grandfather was a World War I hero, but of course had come back and into the same segregation and racism. In fact, his grandfather was essentially murdered. He walked into the city while they were fighting Truro, putting a highway through the black community, and was never seen again. So most likely disappeared and murdered for his activism. So Rocky comes from a family that always had a grounding in African history, in black pride, in understanding their own family. So he put this together very quickly, and then was coming into Halifax at the time that Africville is being destroyed, and is organizing around that. So as the black community realizes that we didn't have strong enough organizing at that time to be able to band together over Africville, and this is where start forming political parties like BUF, Black United Front. And so there's a real push to organize politically in Nova Scotia so that Africville can't happen again. So as there's an awareness in Black Canada, drawn out of the history of the railway porters, so the first black unions, which are black men working on the railway that served as porters, that formed the Brotherhood of Railway Porters. So there's black unionization. These are the only jobs black men can essentially get in Canada. This is partly why there's a heavy black presence in Montreal. It's one of the depots, right? So as this is all going on, you have a student movement at the same time, and Caribbean students coming in, and they're beginning to have conversation with each other. Sir George Williams campus happens over issues of racism in marking and in the school. So there's a particular professor, I think his name's like Perry Johnson, and there's incidents that happen like a black student writes a lab, gets 7 out of 10, a white person's like, can I borrow your lab, copies it word for word, hands it in late, and gets 9 out of 10. So the students were saying when they see our names on our assignments, they're failing. There was incidents in class, the black students were being addressed by by their last names, and the white students were being addressed by their first names. And so they have all these incidents of racism. They report them, and nothing happens. So they are saying this professor's discriminating against us. The university, surprise, surprise, says, we're looking into it. There's a report coming. And then they sit on it for months. The student paper eventually does an expose on this, and this is when the broader university student body comes to understand that these issues are happening. So they end up, the admin refuses to give information on the report, and they end up doing an occupation of the computer lab. This will be familiar to people who are part of the encampment. So they go into the computer lab, and the idea is they're going to, we will leave, we will end this sit-in when you hold this professor accountable and give us information about racism and begin treating people equally. Rather than negotiating, the university calls the police, and the fire is set. They blame it on the students, but it's pretty obvious it's the police who set it because the students are literally barricaded in, so why would they burn themselves to death? The students are throwing like computer punch cards out the window. This is like the famous image. White people gather on the street below and start screaming, "Let the N-words burn," as a fire is going on. The students come out of the lab and they are promptly beaten by the police, so there's a mass amount of police brutality. They're arrested. I think over 100 students are arrested. By the way, only a third of the students are black. The majority of the students were white. So it's an example of cross-student solidarity. It's also taking place in Quebec at the time of Quebec nationalism, and at the time Quebec, I mean, I hate this book, the N-words of North America, that awful book by Pierre Valliere. But the fact is that Quebec is deeply influenced by Pan-Africanism. Aimé Césaire is really influencing Quebec nationalism. So at this point in Quebec, you also have an interest in Pan-African and black solidarity. So you have a mix of this being in Quebec, the Quebec nationalist movement that attaches itself to the Pan-African ideals, and white students. So joining. So it's the black students, surprise, surprise, that get most highly prosecuted. A number of them get deported, including Rosie Douglas, who goes on to become Prime Minister of Dominica. As a result of this, he spends 2 years in jail, where he begins doing prison organizing, and then he's deported. and ends up prime minister. Ann Cools, another student leader, she gets a suspended sentence. She ends up a senator. But these students had this follow them through their lives, so they couldn't get jobs. Many of them were dismissed without their degrees. People suffered deportation, imprisonment. One girl died. She was beaten by the police and then had a brain hemorrhage later. The police don't claim responsibility for that. In 2022, Concordia did an apology, a formal apology for this, and finally admitted that, you know, what had happened to those students was wrong. This is one of the most important events in not only like Black Canadian history. It becomes a huge puncturing of the mythology of Black Canada, and the mythology of Canada as, you know, like more gentler, less polite. In fact, people begin saying perhaps it's worse here than the US. But it also sparks student walkouts across the Caribbean. So as students in the Caribbean, and this is where my family comes in, because my family's in the Caribbean at the time, when I first came to Halifax, every time you said anything about like Concordia, all the Caribbean people would be like, oh, you know it's Sir George Williams, right? Like to this day in the Caribbean, if you talk about like Canadian universities, people bring it up. It was a huge issue because it's over marks, right? Like people care about their mark. You know, it's like, what do you mean they screwed you on your exams? You know, so everybody, there's mass walkouts across the Caribbean, and so Canada's international reputation is severely dented across the Caribbean because of this. It's the first time that globally people really get a sense of what Canada is actually standing for. That the Canada that people thought they were going to, the more progressive, not like the American South, mask is off. And so you get a ton of Caribbean activism about this as well. And this is a huge event, starting with the students, that is a really breaking open moment in the political history of Black Canada, Black Canadian organizing. It happened in the context of two events as well, the Congress of Writers and Artists that takes place, which is an international gathering of writers, artists, and like political figures from across the globe. And before that, about a few months before that, had been a gathering specifically in the context of, I want to say internationalism as well. There have been two major gatherings as well. And so all of this is fomented. So, I guess it occurs to me as I say this that I suppose that's the problem with teachers, isn't it? That they hold a bunch of conferences, they held the Black Writers and Artists Congress, and then people put that into practice, occupied the computer lab, and held the greatest student protest movement in Canada. So I guess learning is dangerous. But I just wanted to share that with you. If you don't know that history, it's an important example of student organizing in Canada. I urge you to watch the documentary. These are things that we learn, but we also learn stuff from the aftermath as well. Ann Cools actually goes on to become a quite conservative senator, and many people who were in that movement end up denouncing her. So we learn stuff about the aftermath of organizing as well. Like I said, many people got deported and experienced criminalization, severe harm and trauma, which I think is important to reflect on as we think about organizing. What happens to us in the aftermath? Like we hold these actions and then how we live with it over the years. I think that's important to reflect upon. But also important to think about how the student movement was at the center of these very international conversations. And so when we're told that talking about Gaza is irrelevant to our education, or again, threatening or not part of how we should be understanding our education, that goes completely counter to what the student movement has always been involved in. It has always been an internationalist movement. It has always been tied into these issues. The next example I'll give, I'll stop on the hour and then we'll take like a 15-minute break. The anti-apartheid movement and organizing, of course, against South Africa. Heavily, in fact, it was the universities that pushed divestment. So exactly the battle that's taking place now around divestment from Israel was the exact terrain that this battle was being fought in the 80s. And through many of the same tactics that you all adopted, encampments, demanding the boards divest, and you got many of the same responses. So Colombia held an occupation. They renamed the hall Mandela Hall briefly. Now it's Hind Hall that was renamed. Same thing, there was encampments, people approaching the board. And also, one of the tactics that they used was using these like value statements, whatever, against the institutions. So looking at what the institutional priorities were and using that against the board. But that was the first big student push for divestment. Took place through the 70s and 80s on university campuses. Dalhousie had a quite significant movement. But it actually starts at Carleton with, they bring in like the South African ambassador to basically give a pro-apartheid talk. And the students pushed back upon this. And much like is happening now, they are labeled as cancel culture. You know, they're suppressing academic freedom. Everybody has a right to share ideas. They're hysterical children. You get the exact same narrative, like word for word, that you get now, because students were like, absolutely not. We're not going to whitewash South African apartheid. And so students at Carleton, as a result, form a group. It's like Carleton Students Against Apartheid or something like that. And they begin pushing their university. So first of all, they go and protest and shut down these events because the South African ambassador is on this tour to present propaganda. And so through McGill, Dalhousie, Carleton, all these different universities start coming into formation. I think Dalhousie is actually the second university to press for divestment in Canada. So that's also an important legacy. Nothing that we do is the first time around, and none of the responses as a result are the first time around as well. In fact, everything they do is deeply predictable because they've already done it before. So just as we adapt our strategies and tactics, so people have reached back into the apartheid movement now to protest current Israeli apartheid and use many of the same responses around the same moral stance on what happens to your student dollars, like when you have to go work full-time to pay fees to come to these institutions so that they can put your money into weapon systems or into propping up apartheid, into killing children. You have a right to speak about that, and you have a right to demand that your fees be used differently. And this was also taking place during apartheid. And again, same responses. So the exact same idea that the students were being entitled, that this was threatening, you got students expelled, people were, the exact same thing. Campuses shut down, bloody police interventions, campuses calling cops on their own students, militarizing the hallways, surveillance, everything that you can imagine that you have all experienced was also the response then. So we can also look to that movement to think about things as they go forward. So I just wanted to raise that as movement, and I had one more, but I've now forgotten it. I can't remember. I don't know. I have to think of these things in my mind. I did some research for you guys, and then, you know, I'm sitting in the cold. So, so never Nova Scotian examples. I can't remember now. I think I was looking up like stuff at NSCAD. But I guess I'll pause there, and I don't know if you guys want to respond. I just want us to think about, I guess, some of the legacy. So I guess some things I'll say that are important is that student movements have never existed in isolation. They've always been successful when they exist in relation to broader movements and when they create those connections. So universities want to be squatters. They want to be on communities but not in communities, right? They don't want you to have relationships to, certainly not to the globe and not to your own communities as well. And especially if you come as an international student or you're leaving home to come to university, you end up in a kind of exile and in a space where the university will never try to connect you to the local community. And so student movements always have to push, not just to care about student issues, including things like exploited fees, you know, the kind of curriculum on campus, who's teaching at your universities, the conditions of life on campus. You also have to push to connect those to broader movements. So student movements have been successful, have always been deeply tied to the labor movement, always tied to internationalist movements, taking cues from that and connecting themselves to that. So I think that's a huge lesson when we look at successful struggle and student-led struggle. It has always been student-led struggle that has openly forged these relationships with other communities and then maintained those solidarities and also understood what the connection is. So there is a connection between real estate development in Halifax and the settlement of Gaza, right? These are coming from the same sources. When we're literally talking of holding, you know, when they're holding real estate events to sell off the land in Gaza, we can think about how that connects to colonized land, settled land in Halifax, and how universities participate in this kind of gentrification and property grab. That's not disconnected. It's the same kind of land theft and resource extraction. So students are right to position themselves in relation to all of those things. You know, we can think about even like, you know, as people that are studying design and art, that has a role. Culture has a huge role. From the, obviously, criminalization of the Giller protesters to the current letter that's out boycotting Israeli cultural industries and the reaction there has been to that, right? So art and culture are often spread as a form of soft propaganda, right? That like, because art is seen as immune in some ways, or it can rise above politics, one way to, you know, continually sort of, you can say, oh, well, you can't ban this artist, right? Oh, like, we can all watch this film. Oh, you know, like the cultural industry. So cultural exports are part of this terrain, and this is what you are part of as art students, as culture producers. You know, whether that's Indigo chapters, right, and their funding of HESIG, the charity HESIG that literally funds people to fight in the IDF and give scholarships, and openly also funds like all kinds of charities and organizations that directly give money to Israel, whether it's that, whether it's your university's investments, whether it's our major prizes. So the Giller Prize is by Scotiabank. This is the biggest literary prize. Scotiabank was a huge investor in Eldit weapon systems. They've now divested partially because of the protests. The Griffin Poetry Prize was funded. The Griffin guy was an arms dealer who was selling those tanks basically to Saudi Arabia for the genocide against Yemen, and that was our biggest poetry prize. So that's where the money came from. So when we look at the cultural industries in Canada, so much of our cultural industries are funded by these destructive industries. So as artists, we have to think ethically around how that positions us. Like, where are we going to publish our work? Where do we display our work? You know, who is the art dealer that's dealing with our work? And do we have an ethical stance on that? So this is not separate. I'll pause there because we're on the hour. Let's take like 15 minutes, run around, get warm, go back in 15, 20 minutes. Like, we don't need to, and then when we come back, we're gonna talk about like what we need for movement, what we have, how we get it. All right, okay, take a break.
I just, when I heard about this 2 days ago, I thought, well, yesterday I thought I gotta look in my old file folders and I dug up some things from a film series I was involved in when I was at NSCAD here, so 85, 86, 87 maybe. There's dates but no years on these. So I pulled out these posters from Life-Size Women in Film, and something that an art show called Nova Scotia Artists on the Threat of Militarism, spelling out NATO. That was at Anna Leonowen's gallery. Now I know all about Anna Leonowen, so I was ignorant of it when I was at NSCAD. And then a couple of, so I'm going to pass the, here's the, here's the life-size women in film, if you could pass them around. Posters that we had, and I called up the president of the college last night just to say we had this film series here in the Bell Auditorium for years. Nobody ever asked us what films we were showing or whether we were allowed to show a certain film. Nobody ever told us that somebody from outside the campus wasn't allowed to come. When we had, especially when we had queer films, the auditorium was full of people from outside of the campus. And then, of course, there were other films that there would be 4 or 5 people, but we had a little committee and chose films, and a lot of them were NFB films, but not all. And I guess there's more of the life-size stuff. There's the poster, new to NATO. And then, now, I can't, there's a couple of people who were involved in doing this Hey Boys Club posters that had different messages, and this is the only one I kept. So this one looks like it was a communal project, because I see, now I'm seeing more. I think that was some of my writing and artwork, and somebody else's had the Hey Boys Club. That was the signal on all the posters. But I'll pass that around. I like the bottom. What does it say? High turnover, low collectivity equals low collectivity. And then the others are, one's just, well, it's relevant to today. I don't know if it ever got made into anything. Thanks, but no thanks. Stop U.S. aid. And do you want nuclear subs in our harbor? And then something else
we do is like less me talking to you and just sort of thinking together. No, I'm okay. So one of the things I thought it might be worth talking about, how many of you were actually at the camp? Okay.
Oh, yes.
So I thought it might be worth just going through, it's really a basic organizing exercise, but just looking at like, what skills do we think we need at this moment in this movement? So what do we need to have? What skills do we have? And where do we want to go? So just thinking about some of the lessons we can teach each other and figure out like, what do we have and where do we, like what do we think is going to be effective moving forward? So we're having this weekend, what next? Like, what do you hope to bring from that? So I thought we could maybe just talk about that all together, not me lecturing. So I don't know if we want to, I don't know, make a circle or something. Or, yeah.